Well, welcome back. I hope I hope you all had a lovely weekend. As always, I'm pleased to have you join me again for another session. I'd like to do something today. I'd like to connect an observation I made, or rather, a number of observations that I made over the weekend with new information, new data that has come and continues to come through with regards to our social landscape and how we are choosing to live, especially in the modern West. Now, without any further ado, let me connect you with a number of stories and then see if I can piece together the common thread across all the stories to see if there's a best fit line. And I'll use that best fit line perhaps as a useful theme for today and this week's interactions. Now, if we go back to the 1960s, in the 1960s, there were as always, in every decade, there is always one or two memorable either publications or articles that are produced, either projecting, predicting, extrapolating observations or trends that have been observed in particular demographic areas. And one of the ones that came to the attention of most people in the 1980s came from the United States. Now, perhaps I should make it clear that generally speaking, in the modern West, and the modern West I include places such as Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, or the whole of North America, the United States of America and Canada. But I also include parts of the developed parts of Europe. Not all parts, a number of countries in Europe. You will also include other parts of the developed West if you were looking at general aspects of economics. But I'm talking specifically about social issues. So I will discard and I'll put aside places like Singapore, Hong Kong, and all the other parts that are not considered part of the West, but were extensions, either by virtue of being part of the British protectorate many years ago. In any case, suffice it to say that for this conversation, whenever I say the United States, you can assume the same extrapolation to the United Kingdom, to Canada, to Australia, and parts of the areas what we call Western civilization, with a lag of perhaps between 1 and 3 years. The US tends to be ahead on a number of social issues. Unfortunately, it exports so many of its social, you might say, social experiments across the whole West. Anyway, but in the 1980s, there was a publication that captured the attention of the West, but particularly in the United States, because the article was written by an American publication with a target towards American women. It coincided with a time when the popular show, Sex and the City, had started to reach audiences, not just in the United States, but far beyond the shores of the United States and North America. In the article, there was a startling prediction. The prediction was so strong that the article and the publication had to be withdrawn because in many ways it jarred the conscience of several people, particularly women. The prediction was a simple one. It simply said that women who are 40 and above, there is a much higher likelihood of being involved, or a higher likelihood that if you were 40 years and above, there's a higher likelihood that you would be involved in a terrorist attack than you would get married. Now, I can understand the emotive, you might juxtaposition. However, there's a simple way of actually dealing with things that are emotionally jarring, and that is simply to look at the numerical equivalent. Now, we know in the UK that the probability of a terrorist attack and the probability of a person, an average person, being involved in a terrorist attack, based on data, we can plot that in a very simple way and say, well, it's 1%, it's 2%, it's 1.5%, it's 0.2%. The point of the matter was that they were juxtaposing the possibility, the probability of being married post 40 and a once in a lifetime event, a terrorist attack, which most people do not experience. Now, that article was so strong, it received so much backlash from the feminist movement and the womanist parties and movements, because what it suggested was that 40 was perhaps the end. You had reached the abyss, and whatever decision you were making, if you were a woman, you had to make it before 40. But it also indicated something unspoken, though, that if you wanted to be married, certain decisions had to be made early, that you could not lead the life or live your life the way men do. Nature starts to close some of its doors for women earlier than it does for men. Now, keep that story aside and contrast the story with something that was published a few months ago. A few months ago, we had some data, a new publication. It wasn't unusual. The publication suggested, now this was shared across the whole of Europe, it suggested that 50% of women by 2030 would be unmarried, without children, and single. In other words, alone. What I found fascinating was, if you were to look at the numbers presently today, if you were to look at from the first article in the 1980s and say, if you were to examine, and this article was in, if I recall, 1985-86, but if you were to look at the 85-86 period and you say, who are those who have been born since 1985-86? Everyone in that generation will fall under what we call millennials, Generation Y. There would be people who would be in their, you might say, mid-30s. You could also include some people who were born before, those from 1980 or those from 1978. In any case, for the sake of this conversation, let me assume that I include all of Generation X, so those born from 1965 onwards. What you find is that if you picked and looked at just women alone, the percentage of people who are considered single today is closer to 50% than the 2030 prediction. We don't have to wait until 2030. What we're finding is that if you look at women below 40, in a significant number, close to 50% in the United Kingdom, and greater numbers if you go outside of the United Kingdom, to the United States, Canada, and other parts of the world. What we find is that the number of people who are unmarried, single, unmarried without children, unmarried with children, unmarried with no prospects, is growing at a rate that is too significant for us to ignore. So technically speaking, the article in the 1980s was correct, because that's stats. The statistics has continued to get worse. Now, put that aside. Two observations, two publications in two different decades. One in the 1960s, another one in the 2020s. Let's just say that. To be more precise, 2023. The difference between both is roughly 40 years. In 40 years, we have seen changes. And here is what's sad. In the publication that came about this year, a few months ago, one of the things that was shocking is that there was almost it was hailed as something to be proud of. The article itself made reference to men, but in a condemning fashion. And when it talked about women being alone and unmarried, it spoke about the article in a way that was to be admired. And so this caught my attention, because over the weekend there were two events that really struck me emotionally. Now, the first occurred on a Friday. Very early on a Friday morning, I had noticed the day before, and this is an observation that is quite hard, normally speaking, for people who are in the city to observe. Now, in this particular instance, I happen to have been in a location where this was observable and noticeable. So if you live in London, it's harder to observe what I'm about to describe. There's something called migrating birds. Birds migrate from places to places, and at different times of the year, you hear and you see birds that migrate. If you live in an urban society or an urban city, in a major city, it's harder to hear because of all the noise, pollution, lack of clear skies, and usually the birds don't actually fly too close to where our line of sight would permit us to see, either because of obstacles or just because of their safety. When you move to rural areas that are more dense, it's much easier to actually see such migrating birds. And I saw the day before migrating birds traveling. Beautiful, beautiful sound. Saw them in a formation, a V formation, fascinating. Let me digress. A bird can fly more than 90 or 9 times further, flying in formation with other birds, than it can flying alone. Fascinating discovery. A bird can fly up to 9 times further with a group, all flying in formation, than it can flying alone on its own. Now, migrating birds travel together as a pack, and it's interesting how they do that. They change positions, and sometimes you have a lead who remains a lead, or you have a lead who substitutes himself with others, so that each person actually takes a lead. Fascinating. The point being that if you study migrating birds, especially if you study the goose or the geese as they fly, for example, Canadian geese, they're very interesting birds. The key point of this is actually that when we are together as a group, we can achieve much more than we can when we are solo. We can rely on the strength and the power, the courage, the vision of other people when we feel weak. I've said in a number of sessions that sometimes you have to find someone who believes in you, and particularly at a time when your belief in yourself is wavering. And you stick with that person until your belief in yourself rebuilds, and then you can rely on yourself. It's the same thing as actually sparring in training. You learn from other people. Iron sharpens iron. That's the whole concept. The next day, which is a Friday, at roughly about 6 in the morning, I was out and I heard I had a goose, a migrating bird, traveling. It was traveling in a direction slightly opposite to the other birds we had seen. Now, there is no correlation between the two packs that I had seen, but here was what was different. It was making a distress sound. It was signaling. This was a bird that had actually lost its pack. Now, I don't know if the pack had left, say, at the early dawn, and perhaps it was still asleep. I don't know. But what I found and what I saw was particularly moving. It was traveling in almost in random fashion. It wasn't coordinated. And it kept signaling, and the more I listened, the more my heart started to break. It was a horrible sound. Anyone who has a child and who's lost a child could perhaps relate to the call a mother has for its child, or possibly the call a child has towards the mother or the father. I noted, and perhaps I hope I was wrong in my observation, that particular bird perhaps could be dead in about a day. The reason being, it's away from its pack. It's expending so much more energy trying to reach through the signals it's sending, trying to reach its pack of other birds. At some point, it will get tired. It's flying all over the place, no direction, confused, panicked, worried, distressed, and at some point it would have to stop. There is nothing more painful as seeing a weak, you might say, animal or person who is prone to predators. The animal kingdom is very, very vicious. And my prediction was, give it a day and it will be dead. It's very unusual, especially because of a lack of energy. Anyway, something came to mind. And what came to mind was the observation I have made in the modern West, especially amongst humans. Now, if you were to look at the two species, or rather humans, men and women, it's more natural for the man to be the lone ranger, someone who travels alone. If you look at the animal kingdom, they tend to hunt on their own. They tend to die on their own. So with regards to men, we are used to dying. We're used to not needing the pack. We're used to not having the group. And therefore, we're conditioned for survival. Now, I have to admit, most modern men have not been passed on that inheritance. But generally speaking, if you take all men, we're conditioned to survive. Protection provision comes natural to us, and therefore our instinct to fight, to protect, to be careful, to preserve our life is much higher than the female species. The woman, on the other hand, or the female, her instinct is to nurture, to love, and to nest. The goose I had seen the day before reminded me of modern women. And here is the point. But there was a slight sadness, which is a bird was sending out its distress signal, calling out for help, calling out for its pack or its group. And I looked at that and I said to myself and my beloved and the people around me, I said, it's a shame. Because if you were to look at modern women these days, especially in the West, they are traveling alone. They are traveling without any direction. They are traveling without any authority, protection, or provision. But they're not sending out distressing signals, which makes it even 10 times worse. Because people are being allowed, young girls particularly, are being allowed to choose a path for themselves. They're being empowered to think that they are like men and that they can survive in the wilderness, in the open, without much regard for survival skills and without any reference to their innate abilities and instincts. And so what we're finding, my observation was, if I were to look at modern women in the West today, it's a shame, it's a real shame that we have conditioned and trained women, and even also sometimes even young men, who do not understand any and do not have any survival skills, who do not know how to call out for help and signal help. As a matter of fact, it just so happens that the women who should be teaching younger women, now I'm talking about women in generation, baby boomers, Generation X, who should be teaching the millennials and the Generation Z and Generation A how to be women and how to seek the protection of the men, and how let me deviate. This is important. I'll go back to birds. Generally speaking, birds with feathers and birds with the ability to fly and birds with the ability to set flight very fast and birds who can fly for longer distances and birds who can fly way above the natural threshold of flying tend to survive much longer over time. Dinosaurs were extinct because dinosaurs were too rigid, too big, inflexible. Smaller birds, which is partly why the likes of chickens and pheasants and you might even say smaller animals that cannot very quickly set to flight and get from a place of safety to another place of more safety, or go from a place of threat to a place of less threat, tend to die over time faster than those that can move quickly. And the reason is simple, because in the animal kingdom, in the natural world, you always have predators and prey. You always have people who are attacking you and people who have to defend themselves. And the more you are able to defend yourself, the higher likelihood of survival and passing your genes to the next generation. Women, and a smart woman tends to nest within the protection of the men. Over history and over time, even when men invaded other tribes, there was one thing the men did not do. There was almost a code of conduct, unspoken. You killed all the men that would be a threat to you, but you did not kill the women and the children. You always took the women and the children, sometimes as slaves, and in most cases, a lot of the women were then made into being part of the community. The women and the children were always protected. Hence, even in the biblical teachings, the prayer for the widows and the orphans. Now, this simply means that as a woman, your natural role is to be around the pillars of protection. You don't have to stand in the place where you defend yourself. You simply have to be in a place where other people die on your behalf. Hence, the beaches of Normandy, the men went and died for this great island. The women were protected. And what we have been doing in the last 30, 40, 50 years is we have been teaching women that they are like men and they should think like men, but we haven't equipped them with the innate skills of survival. We haven't taught them protection and provision in the natural sense, not in the sense of service protection, provision and getting paid a salary. Provision from the perspective of actually when the shit hits the fan, how do you provide your basic skills? We go back to Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Water, food, shelter, basic, what we call physiological needs. They're not being taught all of those items. They've been empowered with the wrong ideology to believe that, one, they do not need men, and two, men are demons, and men should be shunned, and that whatever men can do and have done over time, that they also can do. As a result of this, what you find is the goose I saw sending out a distress signal was doing the right thing. It was simply sending out a signal to say, I need help. I am away from my pact and I'm not safe. Modern women instead, these days, are silent, traveling in the same direction, sometimes going in the opposite direction towards areas where there are predators, refusing to signal and believing that they are much more resilient and stronger than they are. A horrible experience. It will end very badly. We can start to see the data, but it would end badly. Now, let me juxtapose this finally with A conversation I had at the weekend. Now remember, Thursday I saw the migrating birds, Friday I saw the solo bird, and at the weekend I was talking about someone. And the conversation moved again towards societal challenges that we are facing. And we started talking about several people, one of which was an unmarried woman. And this is really sad. An unmarried woman who was raised by her mother to be independent, to feel that she is strong and doesn't need a man, not to see the value of a union between a man and a woman. So much so that this young girl has found herself in a different place, away from her father, away from her mother, away from her natural friends and people she grew up with, in a new place, in a foreign land, engaging in activities that are very masculine, without any awareness of how nature plays its hand, or rather, making a decisive decision to ignore how nature plays its hand, the time window, but at the same time being encouraged by her loved ones, her mother particularly, and her father, to keep flying away and pursue her dreams and enjoy herself. And no one has stopped and said, listen, your behaviors are not consistent with the women of old, and they're not consistent with your best interests, and they are not consistent with where your fulfillment will come from over the long term. There's almost an emphasis on short-term happiness as opposed to long-term fulfillment. And we've brainwashed so many women into thinking, you don't need a family, you don't need kids, you don't need a man, you don't need a structure around you, you need to be free, you don't need boundaries, and that everything and all the inheritances we had from the past were a waste of time, and that there is this new modern wave of womanhood that would transform and transfigure anyone who chooses that pathway or the ideology, and that it would end well. Let me conclude today's session by simply saying there is wisdom from the past, and those who go through life without understanding and appreciating what happened before they were born always make decisions and take actions like children, and often they lead lives that are regretful in the long term. We have to start teaching our young women the importance of the group. We also have to start teaching our young women the importance of men, particularly from the perspective of protection. How men can protect. A man doesn't have to be in your life to protect you. But men, generally speaking, we show up where we are needed, wanted, praised, and called for. And if the signal being sent is, we don't need you, and the woman continues and the women continue to fly into places where there are no protections from those who are the most similar to them, then what you find is that we do a disservice to a whole generation of women, because we did not teach them the right way, and therefore did not lead them the right path, down the right path. And let me bring four of the issues that I talked about today to a close. In the 1980s, the article stated that it would be much easier for a woman above 40 to be involved in a terrorist attack than for her to get married. In 2023, an article was produced, and the article stated that about 50% of women will be single, unmarried, without children, without any spouse or significant relationship by 2030. Now, remember, we are roughly 7 years away from that prediction. In addition to that, we're teaching young women how everything that makes a woman great should be discarded. and a woman should pick up all of the virtues and the mannerisms of men, both bad and good, and should adopt those ideologies to their detriment. I will conclude and say as follows. I was looking at the Office of National Statistics and some of the data. And what it showed was if you were to go back to the 1960s, 1965, 60, 65, in every 1,000, what we found was about 60% of women in the UK were married every year. If you were to look at the data today, what you find is that at 60% or 60 of a number has dropped down to below 20. There's been almost, now I should say, from 60 to less than 20 means roughly about 3.1, 3.3 times, or 313% drop. I was looking at that and saying, okay, this is significant, serious. But no one seems to be taking it into account, because what it simply means is, in order for us to get back to the 1960s and the results of the 1960s, we have to increase the marital rate amongst women, modern women, by more than 313%. That is not possible. That is not possible in one generation. It's probably not possible in 2 generations. The question would be, the trend that continues to go down, would it continue to a point where we get to the bottom? And at that point, would it be too far down the line that the recovery becomes too painful and too distressing, that in many ways we will look back and say that we failed our young girls. We failed them by not giving them the right wisdom, by not teaching them the right path, by actually giving them ideologies that were to their detriment. Now, in the sessions that follow this week, I'm going to start to pick up certain topics to connect to what we just discussed. And I think it would make for some interesting interactions. Now, you understand something, that in today's session, at the core, what I have discussed and the theme relates to what we started 3 weeks ago, in which I asked a simple question. Were you prepared for success in relationships? Because if you were prepared, then you are in the small minority of people who were equipped with the ability to succeed. If you weren't, then it's important for you to start listening to some of these, I would say, contrarian ideas. And I know it's hard, and it's very, very hard, to listen to a man talk about female issues. What you should always accept and keep in mind is an open, good faith, peaceable interaction. And simply ask yourself a question. If a broken clock is correct twice every day, could there be elements of what is being shared that could be right, whether that be 1% or 2%? And if you can find and take that 1 or 2% and apply those into your life with the purpose of helping you achieve your dreams and goals, then the time would have been well spent. So rather than come perhaps believing that this is an attack on women liberation, or we're trying to stop women from being empowered, come with an open mind. No one has all the answers. But I learned something many years ago, which is as follows. You can learn from 2 sides of a ledger, success and failures. If you're learning from other people's successes, you will have a blueprint on what to do right. It becomes easy to apply said actions. But there is another part of the ledger, which is failures. Because you can look at the lives of people who have failed and simply discipline yourself not to repeat their mistakes. And in most cases, because failure requires a lot more effort to overcome, you will find actually by just preventing what I call unnecessary errors of both omission and commission, you are already in the average. So if you avoided mistakes, then you break even. And all you then simply need is a small acceleration of successes for you to be amongst, say, the top 5% or top 15% or top 20% or maybe the top 5% of society. It requires what I call the process of elimination. You eliminate the mistakes completely, and then you choose the successes. And what I'm hoping to do, and I've been doing in these sessions, is draw to your attention both sides of the ledger. There'll be mistakes that you should avoid, and there'll be successes and success equations you should apply. Now, I'll say this and I'll close. Water has two ingredients. When I say component parts, hydrogen and oxygen. Now, we call it H2O. Colorless, odorless. If I drink it, it nourishes me, it sustains me, it enriches me. But I have to mix the compounds in the right way. H, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. Now, if I were to mix that, you might say, those two ingredients in a way different, which is what I liken to a lot of these new ideologies coming with the W movement. I liken it to say, no, I want equality of outcome. I don't agree that 2 parts of hydrogen should be mixed with 1 part of oxygen. I have made a choice. I'm going to mix 2 parts of hydrogen with 2 parts of oxygen. I still have the same 2 compounds, but I've created a different new compound, H2O2. We call that hydrogen peroxide. It's colorless, it's odorless, but if I were to drink it, it would kill me. Same ingredients, but understanding how it should be mixed. It's important to understand that there are good ideas in every ideology, especially if the ideology has stood the test of time. But not all of the ideologies are necessarily for you. Rightly separating the wrong from the right is a key part of good judgment. And so in the sessions to follow, I hope to share some additional information that perhaps will be of interest.